Welcome to Savage Minds. I'm your host, Julian Vigo. Today's guest is Alex de Waal, Executive Director of the World Peace Foundation and Research Professor at the Fletcher School, Tufts University. He has worked on famine, humanitarianism, and conflict since the 1980s as a researcher and practitioner, including a focus on the Horn of Africa. He has spent decades arguing that famine needs to be considered a political act and a crime. He served as a senior advisor to the African Union on Sudan and South Sudan in various capacities. He was listed among Foreign Policy's 100 most influential international intellectuals in 2008 and Atlantic's 29 Brave Thinkers in 2009. He is the recipient of the Huxley Award of the Royal Anthropological Institute for 2024. His books include The Real Politics of the Horn of Africa, Mass Starvation, The History and Future of Famine, and New Pandemics, Old Politics. I welcome Alex de Waal to Savage Minds. I am very excited to have you on the show because I've not only followed your work over the years and some of your politics as well when you were outside of academia. I think your work is very prescient today, given the media attention almost uniquely on the other genocide in Gaza. I think what's happening in Sudan ought to be evoked more clearly within media reports. And then, of course, I'd like to talk to you about the greater issues of what famine is and the politics around it. And let me just begin by saying years ago, when I left the University of Montreal, went to Haiti and was working on child trafficking projects there, I saw how NGOs functioned. As an anthropologist, you get used to seeing them quite a bit. And I remember not even a month in the field, and I thought, there are 10,000 NGOs on this tiny, tiny half of an island. This is too much, and they are doing more harm than good. That's how I came to know of your work, actually, before your work on genocide was about some of the larger questions around intervention, be it from countries to foreign bodies, to this sector of NGO work. I would like to, if possible, begin with discussing the issues of famine prediction and prevention that you key into in your 2017 book, Mass Starvation, where you argue that famines are almost always man-made and preventable. With the ongoing crises in Sudan and Tigray, what early warning signals are policymakers still ignoring? And how can the UN's integrated phase classification system perhaps be reformed to trigger faster responses, faster action? And then, related to my initial statement, how do NGOs fit into this? And are they, in the current situation, doing more harm than good?
So that's a challenging set of questions. And I think to answer it, we have to go back some 40 or 50 years. And we have to understand that famine in the post-colonial era was and still is, of course, but was a very emotional word. And the NGOs who were organizing themselves to work in the field of famine relief did so from a sort of an overhang of those philanthropic sensibilities that had colored the colonial project. So they were moved by compassion, by mercy, by charity, also by a sense that they were saviors, the white savior syndrome, if you like. And there was no objective scientific metric for determining where and when famine was occurring. It was very much an emotional appeal. And increasingly, though, as nutritionists and food security experts became concerned with the issue of famine, they began to say we need to be more systematic. We need to understand this in a more coherent way. And the 1984, 1985 was a turning point in this because the governments, Reagan in the United States, Margaret Thatcher in the UK, which had been elected on what we would now call neoliberal principles of the free market, of people standing on their own, of really not being interested in aiding poorer and struggling countries. They became embarrassed, deeply politically embarrassed by the famine in Ethiopia in 1984, by the efforts of Bob Geldof and other musicians who sang those famous songs, Do They Know It's Christmas and Feed the World. And they said, we don't want to be caught out by these things happening again. We need a famine early warning system. And the first famine early warning system was developed by the United States in response to that. And the motive for having it was primarily, politically speaking, to avoid the embarrassment of the Western publics calling out their governments for lack of compassion, lack of response. And from that developed over the following decades something of an industry in the humanitarian system of refining those metrics, trying to make the aid, which was always limited, but try to make it more effective, try to make it more professional, and try to bring in a standardized system of ascertaining what counted as famine and what didn't. That was the birth of the UN's Integrated Food Security Phase Classification System, the IPC, which wasn't actually designed as a famine diagnostic primarily, but more as a set of instruments for the more transparent and effective targeting and efficient targeting of humanitarian aid. So we understand, you can understand from this that the international aid system was embroiled, entangled in a particular way of viewing famine and the causes of famine, and was not truly interested in looking at the structural drivers. The international NGOs did not want to point the finger either at the governments that stood behind them, especially in the United States, for whatever policies they may have had, economic policies, political policies, or indeed at the host governments, because they needed a government in a country like Sudan or Ethiopia to cooperate with them, to give them permission. So it wasn't helpful if they would then say, actually, this famine is created by the military activities or the political policies of these governments, because then, of course, they would be immediately thrown out. And Western publics like to give assistance to victims of natural disaster who are being saved by these incoming white saviors. They didn't like the idea that these were political problems that ultimately needed political action. So for all these reasons, the understanding of famine and the metrics and mechanisms used for identifying it and responding to it all have a shackle on them, which is a blindness to politics. They just don't want to admit that these are political actions undertaken usually for political and military reasons and can be only properly addressed if we get to grips with those politics.
Yes, I know that even in the case of Gaza, there was much debate, even Is there a famine? Are they being starved? And people were needling with the words and the syntax, but it seems that it has escaped a lot of the people in power at a very high level that these are political actions. I remember years ago when I was teaching a graduate course in New York, there was a text by Ellen Fair. Her text was called The Body Politic, wherein she looks at the symbolic constructions of the body of famine. And she looks at how the body is represented, and she talks specifically about the 1980s and how the Ethiopian famine was represented in a way almost to naturalize this, like those people over there are just subject to it, like as if it were a storm or a hurricane passing through, completely devoid of any kind of political analysis or optics. And I was just wondering, as you were describing the situation for understanding famine, how is it then, since the 1980s, because we all, well, many of us, I think, know how Bob Geldof received a lot of heat for what he did. He was accused of trivializing famine, of trying to fit into the shoes of this kind of God hero figure. And I guess, the average person on the street can see he had his heart in the right place, just like Sean Penn, who I bumped into quite a bit in Haiti. But you can't just pack up a suitcase with money and go and fix the world's problems. How is it that since the 80s to today, the UN has created systems to address this, and have these systems, well, clearly they're not sufficient, but have these systems been able to be ameliorated by actors within? And what are some of the challenges facing famine prediction and prevention, aside from what you just mentioned, of course?
So I think the fundamental point here is that any government that has any form of culpability for famine, be it they are deliberately inflicting starvation as a tool of extermination, which occurs occasionally. They are recklessly pursuing political and military policies that foreseeably create famine, which is the majority of contemporary famines. Or they are indifferent to the suffering, and therefore they're not really interested properly in responding, which is a minority, but a significant minority of cases where the culpability is acts of omission rather than acts of commission. By the way, I should add that I've been developing a historic catalogue of famines, and there isn't a single case since World War II that is purely a natural disaster. They are all triggered or have as a major element political action. The idea that man-made famines are somehow anomalous, exceptional, or new simply isn't true. This may have happened in the 18th, 17th, 16th centuries. It really hasn't happened in any time in the last 100 years. But so if we take as a starting point the fact that governments don't want to admit that these things are happening, or that especially that they're responsible for it, what do? So this denialism is very prevalent. And the most common form of denialism is just to suppress what is news of what is happening and to suppress the pictures, because the pictures can be very powerful. Pictures break through where words can't. But there's a very notable thing about the imagery, the pictures of famine, which is that the perpetrator is not in the frame. The pictures are always of the victims. And if we go back to the early years of photography in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, and we look at famine photographs from India, from South Africa, from other places, what we see is, of course, in those days, photographs had to be staged because exposure times are so long. You couldn't take sort of, instant pictures. You couldn't take ones that the photographer had to have be very active in getting people to pose. And in the case of India, or in the case of Black people in South Africa, the photographs are staged in such a way that, yes, you are moved to pity, but you're also moved to revulsion. You see these people as being reduced to the state of animals, being subhuman. And so that image sort of justifies, in a way, explains away the culpability. It basically, implicitly sends the message: these people are starving because they are not civilized. Maybe they were breeding too much. They had too many children. They'd fallen into that Malthusian trap. Or they were simply ignorant. They didn't know how to feed themselves. But then when the British human rights activist Emily Hobhouse photographed the white Boers who were victims of starvation policies by the British in South Africa at the same time, she made sure to imbue the people she was photographing with dignity. She basically dressed them, or made sure they were dressed so that you could see that they were people who had, in their prior existence, were dignified people, that they had a respectable life, etc. They were dressed up, that the children were holding on to the toys that they'd had. They were looking, calmly with a humane expression at the camera. And what we see, and in doing that, she was taking the first step towards recognizing the humanity of the victim or the survivor. But it required the text to explain the context, to explain that they were not victims of a natural calamity, that actually it was the British government that was starving them. And we see this again in World War II. If you look at the pictures of the Warsaw Ghetto, you will see by this time photography could be unstaged. So most of the pictures were taken that appeared in the newsreels of the Nazis. The Germans, of course, were the ones who were reproducing these. These were unstaged pictures taken by German soldiers who just went on a visit to the Warsaw Ghetto as tourists, if you like, genocide tourists. And those pictures are interesting because they're unstaged. What you see is notably a mixture of people. You see the poor, starving wretches sitting on pavement, and then you see less poor, middle-class Jewish families doing their best to retain a shred of dignity, wearing their coats with their shoes polished, etc., trying to present a veneer of normality. And of course, the nature of any famine is that the weakest starve first. It's the poor, the young, the disabled, the marginalized. They're the ones who starve first. But the text that would go along with this, that when they were reproduced by the Germans, was: here you have a well-off, filthy rich Jewish family spurning their starving neighbor. So the real perpetrator was out of the picture because the real perpetrator was taking the picture. And then fast forward, and we have in the photography of the 80s and 90s, again, the perpetrator is not in the picture. The savior may be. And then you see what happened in Gaza recently. So it was the pictures of starving children that broke through the Israeli narrative that no one was going hungry. And how did the Israelis respond? How did Benjamin Netanyahu react? First of all, he accused the New York Times and others of blood libel. He said, you are contriving these pictures. The children you are showing are already children who are ill, and they produce their medical records. Well, we know, of course, that the children who are already ill, already suffering these conditions, are, of course, going to be the first ones to starve. And if Israel had their medical records, they knew that. So this is not a plea of exculpation. And then the other thing they said was, look at those well-fed Palestinians in the pictures, those who are not hungry. They must be the ones to blame. So repeating the same tropes that we've seen historically. Benjamin Netanyahu was putting himself in a very deeply dishonorable lineage, and he should be utterly ashamed of reproducing that type of propaganda. Then the other question here is the statistics question. So famine, from the time of Thomas Malthus, the theorist of population and hunger, who published his essay on the principle of population in 1798, the idea of famine has been bound up with statistics, with demography, with nutrition, with the balance between the population and its food supply. And that sort of statistical approach still, of course, informs public policy, even by those who have rejected the Malthusian precept that it's overpopulation that causes famine, because in fact, that has never happened in modern times. There is no famine associated with overpopulation. And once the UN, the IPC that you mentioned, had introduced a particular statistical threshold for famine, then culpable governments then try and work around this. They go into the mode of what you might call statistical denialism. So in 2021, when the UN's IPC produced data and its famine review committee said there's going to be a famine in Tigray, it's on track for a famine if there is no aid, if the war doesn't stop. And this famine was one very deliberately contrived, engineered by the Ethiopian government. So what did the Ethiopian government do? It expelled the IPC. It stopped collecting the data. And then it was able to say, look, there's no data for famine. No one can declare famine. There can't be a famine. And to its eternal shame, very senior members of the UN's World Food Programme went along with that. And Israel did this in a more sophisticated way. So Israel did not want the United States in particular to say famine is there in Gaza. And within a few weeks of the military operations that were mounted in the wake of the October 7th Hamas attack and its atrocities against Israelis, both soldiers and civilians, when Israel imposed its blockade, launched its campaign, which was destroying everything that was necessary for people to survive, it appeared within a couple of months that the population of Gaza was headed towards famine. The data were gathered, analyzed. The Famine Review Committee came out with a report. And the US government was very alarmed by this. I mean, the government was the government of the Democrats, of Joe Biden, that had an in-principle commitment to preventing famine. And it very clearly indicated that, should famine happen, then there would be a price to pay. And some of the members of the Senate were proposed to introduce legislation saying that if Israel were to be found responsible for blocking humanitarian assistance, then the US would need to suspend arms supplies. So Israel was sort of under the gun on this one, and what they did was each time the data indicated that particular famine threshold was being approached, they would turn on the aid tap just a little bit more to bring the indicators down from those close to famine levels. And this happened several times. And when in July and August of this year, when those indicators in fact breached the thresholds, at least. So let me explain the three thresholds that need to be breached. There needs to be a threshold of acute food insecurity. People need to have access to so little food that they can't feed themselves on a day-to-day basis. They are forced to do horrible, degrading things to get food, like begging, like scavenging, like eating animal fodder, etc. And that threshold had been breached, for many months. The second was rates of malnutrition. So if child malnutrition rates, according to a different metrics, there are different ways of measuring it, either reach a threshold of 30% according to one measurement or 15% according to another, then that counts. And that threshold was breached at the end of July. And it was headed very much towards a very sharp escalation during August. And then the third metric is level of mortality. And there are no good measures of mortality. And here we're not talking about those who are diagnosed as having died of starvation. We're talking about all those who die in excess of normal rates from hunger and disease and other related causes. Because normally during famine, most of those who die perish from communicable diseases or from lack of medical care, not from starvation as such. And here the data were very soft. So what the Famine Review Committee did was they said famine with reasonable evidence. So they said 2 of the 3 thresholds have been breached. The third one, in our best professional judgment, is possibly may have been breached or will be breached if things continue on the current trajectory. And so they declared famine. And Israel was absolutely furious about this, was furious with the UN's IPC. By the way, it didn't get furious with the US FuseNet. The US government came to the same conclusion using slightly different methods. But the US was not accused of anti-Semitic blood libel, of making up a famine. The IPC was. And frankly, the Israeli argument doesn't stand up. You have to do some extraordinary contortions with the statistics. And moreover, I do agree that the mortality data are soft. But if Israel wants to challenge the IPC's daily death rate, it also needs, which it can do, it can say the rates were not as high, hadn't reached that absolute threshold. The IPC can then turn around and say, but over the last 2 years of acute food insecurity and emergency, we estimate that some tens of thousands of people have perished of hunger and disease. And even though we may not have actually breached that sort of daily death count threshold, that total aggregate has added up over the months, and that will, in due course, count as a terrible famine. And it's clear that Israel is responsible. So we have this early warning system. The early warning system lacks one key element, which is that it doesn't look at the policies and the intention of those doing the starvation. The verb to starve doesn't just refer to the experience of people starving, it refers to the act of starving people. And that is the key thing that we need to bear in mind.
Well, your reference to Malthusianism is interesting to me because his life and his theories emerged during a certain period of poverty that was occurring, in fact, in Europe. So this term comes out of an actual Eurocentric experience, but it has been, especially since the late 20th century, been used mostly to refer to countries that at the time were called developing nations. The term global south is used today. I have issues with all of these terms. I sort of like el cuarto mundo. My friend from Venezuela uses that expression, which I rather like. What is the use and abuse of Malthusianism? Because also Malthusianism had this aspect, if I recall correctly, that warned people from charity.
Yep.
If you give people, then they won't fend for themselves.
So let me slightly nuance what you said about the origins of Malthusianism. So yes, Malthus was very much embroiled in 2 things that were going on within Britain. He was a British reverend and Europe at the time. One was the development of statistics. So statistics associated with life expectancy, with disease. And the other was a debate on whether charity should be given to the poor, or whether in the age of the sort of early capitalism, it was actually better for people to go hungry and abandon the land and go and find work in factories, etc. But the actual particular debate that was going on was to do with the British in India. So in 1770, the British East India Company conquered Bengal, and at the time there was a food shortage, and the East India Company intensified that food shortage by extremely onerous taxation and created a famine that killed about a third of the population, one of the worst famines in recorded history. Rejecting the traditional policy of the Bengali princes, which is you don't tax people in times of hunger, and you actually distribute food from your own reserves to help ameliorate the famine. In the wake of that, the governor of Bengal, Warren Hastings, was brought to trial in the British House of Commons, the first and the only time during Britain's imperial history, until very, very recently, when there was actually a trial for the crimes of imperialism. Now, the trial wasn't imperial conquest as a crime. It was the corruption and the abuse of power in Bengal. And there was a very vigorous debate in the British Parliament, and the concept of famine became very popular. Now, Warren Hastings was ultimately acquitted in 1795, but the debate about the causes of famine was raging, and of that famine in particular, and the responsibility for it was raging. And Malthus published his essay on the principle of population that essentially blamed famine on the people themselves, on their overpopulation, not on any political cause. And so that essay was published just 3 years after the acquittal of Hastings. And 5 years after that, the East India Company made Malthus its professor at its college in Haileybury, just outside London. Now we come into a very rich irony, which is that Malthus was actually a rather humane man, and he never taught his principle to his students. What he actually then did was, having published his essay, he then began to do the research on actual famines, and he found that they didn't follow his precepts. So he in his later versions, his later editions of his essay, he actually basically backtracked. But what happened was that the members of the East India Company and officials in the British government found his original theory so convenient. So they actually went so far as to make the argument that famine is a mercy, because of famine. It happened in Ireland in the 1840s. It happened recurrently in India in the 1820s, 30s, 1860s, 1870s. Famine was a mercy because what it did was it trimmed the population and avoided the worst fate, which was that the population would continue to grow, and they're bringing about an even worse famine. So that was the argument, as you mentioned, for discouraging charity. And what's actually very interesting is we see this argument being revived today. So if you look at the researchers who work on global catastrophic or existential risk, these are people who are very much associated with the tech industry in Silicon Valley, the likes of Peter Thiel, the likes of Elon Musk, of Sam Altman, who's the head of OpenAI. And they're on what they call effective altruism, which is the idea that private philanthropy. They're not interested in public welfare. They're all for the abolition of public revenues and public welfare systems. They say it should be private philanthropy, and their argument is that private philanthropy will do the most good if it ignores the current stresses that people are facing in the world, these little wars, these little genocides, these food crises, and looks to the long-term future of humanity, the future of humanity as a a transhuman species that transcends our planet, that colonizes Mars, that goes off to a future of infinite possibilities beyond the bounds of our humanity, which is why this community, or members of it, I should say, have abandoned the idea that we should object to climate change. They say climate change is happening. So what? Let's look at how humanity, in their very particular sense of people like them, should survive and prosper into a far distant future, overcoming the problems of the current world. So it's a sort of version of Malthusianism on an extraplanetary scale, which I think is a very rather disturbing set of philosophies.
You're listening to Savage Minds, and we hope you're enjoying the show. Please consider subscribing. We don't accept any money from corporate or commercial sponsors, and we depend upon listeners and readers just like you. Now, back to our show. Well, I'd like to return to what you were saying about colonialism, because one thing that I have noticed when I see the NGOs and the UN and all these networks set up shop in whatever recent disaster area, crisis zone, humanitarian relief, etc., what I notice is that it has all the markings of a new kind of colonialism, if I might say. The same kind of classes infiltrate these systems. They're massively people who go to Ivy League or Oxbridge. They head into these NGOs or the UN programs. They hope to achieve a P5 status. And it seems like the machinations of a lot of I don't want to, paint with a broad brush all of them, but I just saw so much that it's really hard not to, where they're going in to treat a sucking chest wound with a little plaster. And they're treating not the problem, but the issues caused by the problem. So, of course, starvation and famine, these are horrible items that one must solve. But at the same time, I think what I see on the sector of international NGOs, even NGOs that are domestic, is that it's become its own industry. This is what I heard from people. I wrote a book about this, actually. So the people I was working with in Haiti and interviewing people in FAO, UNICEF, you name it, they said, we've seen all the same people who are here. They were in Sri Lanka a few years ago. They all knew each other from the tsunami. And I found it very interesting to see how many of the people in these organizations are not naive. They're very critical. And they say things to me like, one said to me, well, we're rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. Have you noticed that almost everyone here in Haiti has a 3-month contract and they're going to be shipped off? Someone else will come in and very likely they'll be given the exact same mandate because nothing really ever changes. And I've heard from others who said it's almost as if we're being paid to keep the status quo.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of truth in what you say. I would say, let me qualify what you've been saying with a couple of observations. The first is that the growth of this what I call the humanitarian international in my writings actually did coincide with a reduction in the number and the lethality of famines. There was an improvement in the scale and in the professionalism of response. So I think while it's true, undoubtedly, that this system didn't grapple with the causes, the political causes, it did become more effective at attending to the symptoms, and therefore it did save lives. And I think that on balance is a good thing. And when I look at what the Trump administration has done in destroying USAID, I would have wanted to see USAID massively reformed, but when it was chopped down with a chainsaw, and when there were USAID was supporting 900 was the key. So in the emergency in Sudan, there were 1,400 community-run emergency response rooms running soup kitchens by local volunteers, actually, all local Sudanese, supported by USAID. Not its major effort, but an important effort. And when USAID was felled, 900 of those 1,400 had to close. There were cases where you had NGOs, both international and Sudanese, who had staff, who were nurses, who are running feeding centers, feeding acutely malnourished children, and they got stop work orders. And I don't know how many of those children died, but I fear the number is many. So, yes, the system was not addressing the causes, but it was becoming quite effective at remedying, at healing some of the surface wounds. The second is that there was also this self-criticism. There was an awareness among the practitioners of the shortcomings. And that led, in the last 10 years, to quite a few efforts to begin to address some of these. So we had more efforts in the field of international criminal law, amendments to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, pressure for international tribunals to bring cases of the war crime of starvation. And of course, Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant have been charged with that war crime by the ICC. And we saw the UN Security Council pass Resolution 2417 in 2018, which reaffirmed that, starvation of civilians could be a war crime and that the UN should be activated whenever there was a possibility that armed conflict would lead to widespread food insecurity. So I think the system had some redeeming features. That said, I completely agree. It was not addressing the fundamentals, and indeed, there were many, including some liberal hawks within the U.S. Democratic Party, that saw this type of international humanitarian activism as the reason for interventionism. So what we saw was, the Bush administration with its neocons. Obviously, they intervened in Iraq, and that was a calamity. And then the liberals in the Obama administration insisted they would go into Libya to stop what they saw as a threatened genocide, ignoring the calls of the African Union and many others to say, actually, what we need is a negotiated political settlement. And that was a calamity not just for Libya, but for the world, because Russia went along with that resolution, the relevant resolution at the UN Security Council, and then regretted it. And Putin said, okay, here's a red line. We are not going to allow this to happen in Syria or anywhere else in the world. And so that sort of overreach, that liberal overreach is, I think, culpable in what's happened in the world since. Now, this is highly relevant to the case of Sudan, because Sudan and the war in Darfur, which was described by Samantha Power, by Susan Rice, by others in the Democratic administration, as genocide, warranting the most radical types of liberal interventionism, sending troops, sending President Bashir of Sudan to the ICC. This was their test case. This was their guinea pig. And what that did was that precluded the ability of the Sudanese to find political solutions. Now, I'm the first one to condemn President Bashir for all manner of crimes. But I think it was a mistake to charge him at the ICC, because it basically sent the message to him that if he were to step down from power, that's where he would end up. So the prospect of a negotiated transition of power, of a more equitable peace settlement for Darfur, etc., all of those essentially were sacrificed to to these principles, the imposition, if you like, of a liberal imperium. And those people will, who are advocates for this radical action, will look at the situation in Sudan today, and they will say, yes, it is the same villains as before. We didn't bring them to court. We didn't impose a new political order on Sudan at the time. We didn't do enough, to which my response was, well, when you were able to do more by actually invading the country and putting in place a government of your choice, it didn't work out terribly well. So surely it would have been better to have stepped back and to given space for the Sudanese to come to a political settlement, less than ideal, but maybe one that would have allowed for a workable transition to democracy, a workable peace and justice settlement for Darfur and elsewhere.
In your recent article, Lineages of Genocide in Sudan, you go through at one point the history of genocides. Now, a lot of people watch, again, going back to Ethiopia in the 1980s, and that's just a natural thing because they have no water. This is what ABC, NBC, and CBS were telling us this in the 1980s. In your article, you have a section, Postcolonial Genocides, where you go through the genocides that have taken place in this region from 1955 to 72, and then from 1983 through 2005. Now, a lot of people who are completely ignorant about the history of the region will just say, oh, that's what people over there do. They just war, and the same thing happened with Rwanda in 1994. There's this kind of naturalization of what people from the global south just naturally do to each other. Could you contextualize what has happened in post-colonial nation states that has led, in this specific instance in Sudan, to the kind of troubles that the end result is war, genocide, starvation of various forms, and other humanitarian crises? Because I think the international community's earlier tolerance of the Janjaweed model to many contributed to the current catastrophe in Darfur and Khartoum. At the same time, there's a backstory to these wars. Could you describe why and how these civil wars have come about so frequently in Sudan?
So Sudan is an extreme example of a much more widespread phenomenon. And it's the phenomenon of a government, a state, not having the type of resources and the type of political and economic conditions that make it possible to have a stable, institutionalized government and a workable social order, which is a precondition for democracy. So basically, the history of this is that in the late 70s and 80s, through a combination of factors, including internal mismanagement, but also in particular the extremely unfavorable external economic environment and the imposition of austerity measures and the very unforgiving nature of the conditions imposed by Sudan's creditors, because Sudan was, never enjoyed financial sovereignty. It was always borrowing in US dollars. And so the holders of its US dollar debt were the ones who could dictate basically the economic framework under which Sudanese lived and died. Now, in order for there to be a working social order, you need several things to be in place. You need enough public revenue to pay for basic services and welfare. You need those in power who have the choice between sustaining themselves through public revenue and taxation and an orderly institutionalized system, and have the choice of turning to asset stripping, to predation, to theft, in order to maintain the basic infrastructure of staying in power, which is ultimately a military infrastructure. In order for those in power to go for that preferred option of saying we will tax the people, we will have we will have this more stable institutionalized system. They need to have a long-term time horizon, and they need to have assured resources. If they don't have that, they can't simply say, okay, we will, tighten our belts to the point where we are starving, knowing that in due course, in 10 or 20 years, we'll be better off, because maybe many people in the meantime will starve, but most particularly for the people in power, they will be removed. Somebody will rise up and remove them. There will be a coup, there will be an uprising, there will be a split in the government, something will happen. Politics, the pace of politics, the weekly pace of politics cannot wait. If those resources are the public resources are not there. And what we saw in Sudan was this happened. And so what did the government do? So I first went to Sudan in 1984, and then the following year, the government, it was in a so-called democratic transition, but it had been cut off by the IMF. It couldn't borrow money. It had literally, civil servants were not being paid, and it faced a rebellion in the south. So what did the Minister of Defense do? He toured the areas neighboring the south, which were inhabited by a group of semi-nomadic, Arabic-speaking, cattle-herding people. And he said, we'll give you the guns. You go ahead and help yourself to what you can in the south, and pay yourself, essentially, by looting, by taking women and girls, by taking land, etc. And that militia model was the only way that they had of staying in power. And essentially, versions of that militia model were reproduced time and time again over the following years. The Janjaweed were another version of it 20 years later. And ultimately, if you do that, you're going to have most of your country as sort of an ethics-free zone, a place where local people will pursue their vendettas. They will seek to reward themselves by whatever means necessary. And your job, if you are the head of state, if you're head of security, is to stay on top of this. The ruler of Yemen, Ali Abdullah Saleh, called it dancing on the heads of snakes. And you can do it if you have a lot of political skill and you have a lot of what they call in the Arab world political money, the political budget, the money to buy the loyalties of those who are administering violence locally. And when you don't have that, or if those who are in possession of that organized militia become too powerful, they will challenge you. And that is what happened in Sudan at the beginning of this war 2.5 years ago. The heirs of the Janjaweed reformulated as the paramilitary rapid support forces under the command of their most capable businessman, entrepreneur, military commander, Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, known as Hemeti. He basically said, well, actually, I'm now more powerful than the regular army. And when my partner in the army, who is my supposed boss, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, tells me that he wants my militia to be under his command, I'm going to say no. And that's what happened. So Hemeti tried to launch a coup. It didn't work. The city of Khartoum was destroyed in the fighting. The war spread to Darfur. And what we see is the same. So the same sets of factors: the collapse in public revenue, those in power unable to ask their people to wait, and unable to control their subordinates, their armed subordinates, except through these very short-term policies of paying them off and turning to asset stripping, predation, corruption, crony capitalism, etc. This is what is happening much more widely across that region.
After decades of documenting preventable horrors from Darfur to Tigray to Yemen, what keeps you believing that policy can still outrun atrocity? And which historical case of successful famine prevention do you point to as a model?
So the best modern example was Ethiopia. Ethiopia overcame this. Ethiopia, which had been the land of famine for decades, was after 1991 for 30 years free of famine. It was actually a model for how you can do it. The current leader of Ethiopia, who came to power some 7 years ago, threw all that away. He took it for granted that Ethiopia was becoming prosperous, and went down the road of embracing disorder, embracing corruption, waging unnecessary wars, inflicting genocidal famine. And sadly, Ethiopia has thrown away those lessons, which is doubly tragic, because Ethiopia was on the cusp of being the success story that could prove that that the ending of famine was possible. What gives me hope on this is that the norm, the ethic of simply the idea that starving children is wrong resonates. The time that we saw Benjamin Netanyahu really rattled, not in command of the narrative, forced into all sorts of contortions, was when he was confronted with the fact that he was responsible for starving children. There were children starving in Gaza. He could stop it, and he hadn't stopped it. And the fact that those who elsewhere in the world who are responsible for these crimes go to all these lengths to conceal and deny it shows us that they know that it is wrong. And so I'm hopeful that with the rollback of all the international norms and standards and values that we're seeing at the moment, that the line will be drawn at this one. And that can be the basis from which we can begin to rebuild a more humane world order.